Every one of these fortunes promised the same impossible thing: money that grew without work, without risk, without end. A teenager drove a Ferrari before his company ever cleaned a single carpet. A postal coupon turned into a fortune, then a prison cell. One of these pyramids grew so large it didn't just empty bank accounts, it toppled a government. $2 and a stamp. Charles Ponzi landed in Boston with $2 in his pocket and a plan built on international postal coupons, a paper that let someone in one country buy stamps cheap and redeem them for more value in another. He promised investors 50% back in 45 days, a return no bank could match. Early investors were paid from money new investors brought in, so the returns looked real, which meant more investors came, which meant the promise had to grow faster than any coupon trade ever could. By the summer of 1920, his company was said to be worth about $15 million, close to $200 million in today's money, though almost none of it was postal coupons at all. A Boston fish peddler mortgaged his house to hand Ponzi his savings, certain the 50% would arrive on schedule. It never did. A newspaper investigation and the state's bank examiners found the math could not work. Honoring every certificate would have required more coupons than existed on the planet. Ponzi was arrested that August. He served over a decade in prisons in 2 countries and died in a charity ward in Rio de Janeiro in 1949, without enough money left for his own funeral. The Match King. It was the safest investment in Europe. It was built on forged signatures nobody had checked. Ivar Kreuger controlled a global monopoly on matches by the late 1920s, lending money to governments in exchange for the exclusive right to sell matches inside their borders. His empire ran on holding companies, shell firms that owned pieces of other companies instead of running anything themselves, financed by bonds that grew harder to trace with every new layer. To keep the loans flowing, Kreuger folded new financing into what looked like operating profit, so a business running low on cash could still report earnings that climbed every year, which kept lenders confident enough to offer the next loan. At its peak, the empire was valued at roughly $2 billion, tens of billions by modern standards. A Swedish shareholder who had put his family's inheritance into Kreuger's stock watched it become worthless within a year. A junior auditor sent to verify Italian government bonds Kreuger claimed to hold found signatures that matched no official on record. Before the findings became public, Kreuger was found dead in his Paris apartment in March 1932, in what appeared to be a self-inflicted death. What investigators found afterward was a paper trail built to survive scrutiny only as long as no one asked to see it. The Teenage Empire. Barry Minkow was 16 when he opened a carpet cleaning business out of his parents' garage in Reseda, California, and 20 when Wall Street valued it at nearly $300 million, several times that by today's standards, enough for the red Ferrari he now drove to the office. His real cleaning business barely broke even, so he invented a second, larger one: fake insurance restoration contracts for buildings that had supposedly flooded or burned, backed by forged paperwork and rented offices dressed up for site visits. Each fake contract let him borrow more, which paid off the last loan, which let the company report growing revenue, which convinced auditors the fictional business was real. He took the company public in 1986 through a reverse merger, folding it into an already listed shell company to skip the usual scrutiny of a stock market debut. An investor who bought the stock at its peak, following analysts who called it the next great growth story, watched the shares become worthless within weeks. The fraud unraveled when a journalist and Minkow's own credit card processor started asking why a company with such large contracts had almost no cash moving through its bank accounts. Minkow was convicted of fraud in 1988 and sentenced to 25 years. The case became a textbook example regulators still use to train auditors to verify a company's largest contracts in person, not from a folder of paperwork. Mavrody's millions. In 1994, tens of millions of people across Russia were buying shares in a company that made nothing, sold nothing, and promised to double their money within weeks. Sergei Mavrody built MMM around a simple mechanic. Money from new shareholders paid the returns promised to earlier ones, while state television ads showing ordinary people getting rich pulled in more money every week than the last. As deposits poured in faster than any real business could generate profit, the share price Mavrody quoted kept climbing on paper alone, detached from anything the company actually owned, an estimated equivalent of $1.5 billion at the time, several times larger by current exchange rates. A factory worker in the Russian provinces who put in a year's wages watched the promised value multiply for months before the payout slowed, then stopped entirely. By July 1994, MMM could no longer pay out, and the scheme collapsed. Mavrodi evaded arrest for years, was elected briefly to the Russian parliament for the legal immunity it offered, and was finally convicted of fraud in 2007. He served 4.5 years, then spent the rest of his life running smaller versions of the same scheme in other countries. He died of heart failure in Moscow in 2018, having never repaid the people who trusted him the first time. A country bets everything. By the end of 1996, investment company storefronts sat on nearly every street corner in Albania, with taped-up posters promising to double a family's savings within months. Albania had just emerged from decades of isolated communist rule, and its citizens had almost no experience with banks, stock markets, or fraud of this scale. Several companies offered interest rates far beyond anything a legitimate bank could pay, and paid them, at first, from money new depositors brought in. Word spread through villages and cities that neighbors were doubling their savings, which brought in more depositors, which let the payouts climb until the schemes held deposits equal to roughly half the entire country's economy. A retired teacher in the port city of Vlora put in his family's savings, along with money borrowed from relatives abroad, expecting to buy his son a house. When the largest schemes stopped paying in early 1997, an estimated 2/3 of the population had money trapped inside them. Riots broke out within weeks, government armories were looted, and the unrest that followed caused more than 1,000 deaths before international peacekeepers arrived. The government that had allowed the schemes to operate resigned within months, and the country's financial regulators were rebuilt almost from scratch under international supervision. The cricket sponsor. In 2008, the same year cricket fans in the Caribbean cheered a $20 million tournament bearing his name, Alan Stanford was quietly running one of the largest fraud schemes in American history out of a bank in Antigua. Stanford International Bank sold certificates of deposit, a kind of savings account that promises a fixed return, claiming they were backed by a conservative portfolio of safe investments. The portfolio barely existed. New deposits paid earlier depositors and funded Stanford's private jets, a cricket stadium, and sponsorship deals that made his name synonymous with respectability, and every glossy sponsorship photo made the bank look more legitimate, which pulled in still more deposits, which funded the lifestyle that had attracted them in the first place. In Texas, a pilot nearing retirement moved his entire pension into Stanford certificates on his broker's recommendation, believing the bank's 20-year track record made it safer than his own bank down the street. Regulators had received warnings about Stanford for over a decade before the Securities and Exchange Commission finally froze his accounts in February 2009, revealing a hole of roughly $7 billion, closer to $10 billion once adjusted for inflation. A federal jury found Stanford guilty in 2012, and he was sentenced to 110 years in prison. The stadium built to advertise his bank's safety was eventually sold off to help repay the people he ruined. Settlements that never existed. The documents looked airtight. Real case numbers, real letterhead, a respected law firm's name at the top of every page, and not one of them was real. Scott Rothstein was a well-connected Fort Lauderdale attorney who told investors he had access to confidential legal settlements, cases too sensitive to become public, and offered to sell them at a discount, promising a guaranteed return once the settlements paid out in full. There were no settlements. Rothstein forged the paperwork, pulled real case numbers from public court records, and paid early investors with money new investors handed over, which kept his reputation as a rain-making attorney intact, which brought in still larger sums from people who trusted his standing in the Florida legal community. A local businessman who had known Rothstein for years put in several $1,000,000, treating it as a safe deal between old friends rather than a stranger's pitch. By late 2009, Rothstein could no longer cover the payments. He fled briefly to Morocco before returning and confessing. Investigators found the fraud totaled roughly $1.2 billion, worth nearly double that figure by today's standards, funded almost entirely by paperwork that had fooled experienced lawyers and bankers alike. Rothstein pleaded guilty in 2010 and was sentenced to 50 years, and the law firm that once bore his name no longer exists in any form. Missing billions. For a few years, cryptocurrency's most trusted exchange was run out of a Bahamas penthouse by a 20-something in cargo shorts whom investors compared to a young Warren Buffett. FTX let customers deposit money and cryptocurrency to trade, the same way a bank lets customers deposit cash. Behind the scenes, Sam Bankman-Fried funneled billions of dollars in customer deposits into Alameda Research, a trading firm he also controlled, to cover Alameda's own risky bets and mounting losses. As long as crypto prices kept rising, rising, the gap between what customers thought they owned and what actually remained in FTX's accounts stayed hidden, so new deposits could keep covering old withdrawals without anyone noticing the hole underneath. A software engineer in Singapore who had moved a large share of his savings onto the exchange tried to withdraw his funds in November 2022 and found the request simply would not process. Within days, FTX admitted it could not cover customer withdrawals, filed for bankruptcy, and investigators found a gap of roughly $8 billion, a sum that hasn't lost meaningful value in the few years since, between what customers were owed and what the exchange actually held. Bankman-Fried was convicted on multiple counts of fraud in 2023 and sentenced to 25 years. Exchanges that once resisted outside audits began publishing proof of their reserves within months, a practice regulators now treat as close to mandatory. The trusted name. It was the most exclusive investment club on Wall Street. Getting rejected by it was oddly considered a mark of honor. Bernie Madoff ran what looked like a steady, unspectacular stock trading strategy that quietly outperformed the market for decades, open only to those wealthy or connected enough to be invited in. There was no strategy. Madoff simply paid steady returns to existing clients using the deposits of new ones, and the appearance of exclusivity did the marketing for him. Rejection made people want in more, which brought in the very money that kept the fiction running for over 20 years. A retirement-age couple in Florida had moved almost their entire nest egg into Madoff's fund on a friend's recommendation, trusting decades of statements that never once showed a losing month. When the 2008 financial crisis pushed clients to withdraw more than Madoff could cover, the fund collapsed within days. Madoff confessed to his own sons, who reported him to federal authorities before the next morning. Investigators found a scheme totaling roughly $65 billion on paper, worth closer to $90 billion measured today, the largest of its kind ever uncovered. Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison and died there in 2021, having built his entire empire on a single word: trust. Which of these collapses surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for the next one.